chat to me. So, is the poltergeist a thing? Well, usually is the miniskirt a thing, or is, our pink tiaras a thing this season? But in this case, I mean it literally, as in, is it a thing? I'll explain what I mean by that as we get going. I realized last week when I was suddenly asked if I could do a webinar that I have never actually really spoken about poltergeists, and I've more or less avoided the subject since the very beginning of the webinar series. So I thought tonight I would just quickly run through a few thoughts on poltergeists. They're very much my own ideas, some of them. Some of it's historical, and some of it, as I say, is probably theoretical and dull, but hopefully you'll find it engaging. So what do I mean when I say, is something a thing? Well, is a unicorn a thing? Is the fall of a unicorn a real thing? Well, we all know what I mean when I see a unicorn, but it doesn't actually exist. Flu, is flu a thing? Flu is a thing, surely. We've all caught it. We all know what the symptoms are. But if I have flu, it is a terrible, dreadful, awful disease that leaves me, utterly distraught, laying on my bed and weeping. And if Becky has flu, she says my flu is just a sniffle, and her flu is the real thing. So flu could be subjective. And one of the things I'm going to get at tonight is that just because something is a thing or exists doesn't mean to say that it represents itself in the same way. One of our users tonight, David Sivia, I've known since he was 19 or 20 years old. He's known me since I was 18. We met at university. And it's likely that we know each other in a sense that the rest of you don't. We've got a different relationship. And one of the things that I've been playing with recently is the notion that a poltergeist is more like a relationship than an object. Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Let's start with the beginning. So, poltergeists, this is what I'm going to go through tonight. I'm going to talk about the definitions. Sorry, this is artwork I did for it. Poltergeists, definitions, history, theory, practice, summary. So it's not going to be that long, and large parts of it will involve you guys talking. So hopefully I won't bore you all too much. Right, put that up there. Next one. So first question, straightforward one, is what is a poltergeist? Simon Grace, I can see you there. What's a poltergeist, sir? You'll have to unmute yourself. I can't hear you.
Okay. Poltergeist, coming from the German polter, noisy, geist, ghost.
Yep.
Hollywood stuff is like throwing various bits of stuff around. Yvette Fielding would have anything that moves as a poltergeist.
Yep.
And that's about all I know.
Absolutely great.
Some degrees of intelligent when it comes to communication, if you believe in all that, and basically just wants to make itself known.
Okay, let's scroll along a bit and let's ask Michelle Pierce. Michelle, can you hear me? You're muted on your phone. You can't unmute? We can't hear you. There we go, can hear you. What is a ghost? Hi, Michelle. What would you say a ghost was?
A ghost or a poltergeist specifically?
A ghost this time, different to a poltergeist.
This time. I would say that a ghost is, or it could be anything that is suspected to be a ghost at the time until proven otherwise. Anything that's a bit out of the ordinary, anything that the person interprets as a little bit strange, and it may fall into a number of baskets that we associate with ghosts. For instance, seeing an apparition or hearing a rattling of chains or any number of other things.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really useful. Yeah, okay, so a ghost is a kind of anomaly that we call a ghost because it's ghostly, basically. Yeah. Stu Neville, what's a haunting?
Evening. What's a haunting? I suppose a haunting is either a place or more rarely a person, which seems to have God almighty, it's difficult to say, isn't it? Has a non-mundane presence about it. So it could be a ghost, could be a pulp, could be a cryptid, could be all manner of things. But it's something, it's a particular place or a particular person that's associated with an otherworldly or another realmly presence, for want of a better word, in whatever way. How about that?
Yeah, that's great. So we talked about them as kind of categories, really, or symptoms rather than qualities. If a poltergeist is defined as a 6 foot tall invisible white rabbit called Harvey, then for those of you who know the film, you'll get the joke. Then poltergeists would, or pukas in this case, you know, be have certain qualities. We'd be talking about the entity itself. But most of the time, we never actually get to see the poltergeist. Just as when you have flu, you never get to see the virus. You only see the effects of the virus on the human body. So one of the first things I'm going to say tonight is that poltergeists, ghosts, and hauntings, whatever may underlie them, we are not actually directly perceiving the cause or agent. We are usually dealing with, unless we're spiritualists, we believe we're dealing with the symptoms. So when those symptoms make no sense to us, the symptoms of influenza don't make any sense to us, and the actual medical understanding of how the virus attacks the body, it comes under nosology, the study of disease. Doesn't mean to say that my experience of having flu isn't real. Doesn't mean to say that the way in which a biochemist or the way in which a doctor or the way in which, you see, there are different levels at which you can look at a virus and how it affects the body. And each of those different levels is true and meaningful. But from my perspective, as the sufferer, I do not really need a knowledge of the biochemistry. I deal with symptoms, not with the qualities, not with the thing in itself, not with the virus. So maybe one of the reasons, and this is part of the argument I'm going to deal with tonight, is that poltergeists are so bloody mysterious, is that we're not actually really ever dealing with them. We're always talking at one remove about their behavior or their activity. Everyone, I think, seems to be in agreement that poltergeists are not ghosts, are not hauntings. And again, I don't think that's the case, but we'll get to that later. I think they're all the same thing. Or at least I think that's very likely. However, when we bear in mind that the phrase haunting is used to describe such a wide variety of things, and ghost is used and poltergeist is used to such a wide variety of things, it would be unsurprising if there wasn't significant overlap. When I go through tonight, hopefully, stop me if I don't make sense, but it will get a lot less abstract after we get off this page. So there's a difference between a thing, like the virus, which causes flu, and a behavior, which is how we experience it. One thing, a question at the bottom, and you'll notice the little demonic duck of Hunstanton there. The demonic duck of Hunstanton, I think, is going to be used quite a bit tonight. One question somebody asked me many years ago was they had a poltergeist and their house was being subjected to strange smells and scrawling on walls, and objects were being moved and there were whispering voices. And they asked me, in all seriousness, is this a demon? And I said, of course it's not. It's a poltergeist. A poltergeist are dead scientific. Demons. And then I thought about it for a moment and actually thought, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, you know, if the behaviors are those of a demon, and or what we popularly call a demon, who am I to say it isn't? You know, is a poltergeist a demon? I don't know. But that's why there's a duck there, because sometimes if the behavior is the same as what we would expect from a little red imp in a Bugs Bunny cartoon, then I'm in no position to say it's not a demon, am I? So what is a poltergeist? Well, the standard theoretical basis that arose in parapsychology differentiates between person-centered hauntings. Here we see a photo, one of the many famous photos from Enfield, and on the right there's Borley Rectory in 1892 with 4 of the Bull sisters standing there. Person-centered hauntings are, you can have guessed this, are based on people. Place-centered hauntings seem to be related to locations. Historically, poltergeists have tended to follow people when they move house, or at least that is the belief that has been current throughout much of history. And indeed, in some cases, poltergeist phenomena is said to have followed people home when they go home from an investigation. I'm going to talk more about that later on. So this distinction between person-centered and place-centered hauntings has become quite central to a lot of the parapsychological discourse over the last century and a half. I'm going to try and avoid talking too much about the history of poltergeist because Christopher Lawson does it so much better. I just, I cannot compete with Christopher's knowledge. Let's move on. A ghost versus a haunting. Well, a ghost is simply an apparition in this sense. I'm using the term at its most simple. It's an appearance of a human being. There's the newbie, Kirby. Newton Kirby, I can't remember the name of the church, but there's the famous church apparition on the left and a haunted house on the right. So a ghost is simply a visual apparition, a sighting of a figure usually. A haunting is simply a location where ghosts are seen over a period of time. And we tend to reserve the term haunting for where multiple witnesses have perceived purportedly paranormal events over a period of months or years without being, primed by each other. Oh, so why do we think that ghosts and poltergeists are different things? I'm gonna keep this bit fairly simple because it's probably the least interesting part, but it's very interesting to me, but probably not anyone else. The great revolution in the history of the study of parapsychology and psychical research and all of the things we're interested in happened in 1882 when Barrett convened what became the first meeting of the Society for Psychical Research. And the Society for Psychical Research basically took the study of apparitions, ghosts, hauntings, poltergeists, and all kinds of phenomena of that nature and put them firmly on the agenda. They took them full scale into science, and a number of brilliant leading minds of that era threw themselves at the question. And they made massive progress over the first 20 or so years in which the society existed. And indeed, they continue to this day and do well today. In 1888, however, there was a schism which led to a very large number of members. I believe it was as many as 300, but I could be wrong, leaving the SPR. And William Stainton Moses was among them. Now, I believe he returned his membership and indeed stayed involved to some extent. And they went on to form the London Spiritualist Alliance and later the College of Psychic Studies. Is it? I can't remember what it's called now. But various studies, various organisations that emerged from that. And the schism, was between two factions. You could call it the skeptical, scientific-minded bunch, who by that point had started to adopt a very different paradigm. And the paradigm that they were approaching was the notion that a lot of so-called paranormal activity didn't have its origin in ghosts and spirits at all, but in powers of mankind that were as yet not understood. And possibly the most important of those was thought transference, which they coined a word for. They called it telepathy. So human psychic powers were responsible for a lot of phenomena. And if the dead survived, they communicated to us by thought transference or telepathy, or as Upton Sinclair called it 50 years later, or 60 years later, mental radio. So this theoretical split and the fact they debunked so many mediums, psychic mediums and spiritualists as being frauds, led to the SPR, or the Psychical Research Society, as almost everybody called it at the time, actually getting a reputation as debunkers, skeptics and cynics. It's ironic now, but at the time it was very much seen as being, opposed to any kind of spiritualist agenda. And after 1888, that actually became increasingly true, though they were still very, very, very much interested in the question of survival. Do human beings continue after death? In 1894, they carry out the magnificent census of hallucinations, in which they ask a huge number of people about their experiences of ghosts and hauntings. And what they discover very quickly is that there appears to be an objective phenomena, and they discover a number of what they call veridical cases, which cannot just be hallucinations. So they also discover a large number of collective cases where more than one person sees a ghost. So why did I bother to go through this? Well, in the 1894 census, they do not ask questions about physical phenomena. They ask about seeing an apparition, seeing a ghost. And by this point, there seems to be a strong theoretical break between physical phenomena and seeing a ghost. Why is that? Well, what was almost certainly behind some of this was the bloke on the left, who is Daniel Douglas Hume. He was an extraordinary chap. There's a wonderful photo of him where he's dressed up in an outlandish costume and is gazing at a skull. And he looks like some kind of goth off a London After Midnight album cover from the 1990s or something. He was handsome, a little bit naughty, and incredibly talented as mediums go. But he did not usually blame the spirits or credit the spirits for his magnificent miracles. He claimed that the power lay within himself. And the notion of psychic powers as being something separate to spiritualist phenomena, I think, might date back to Hume. On the right, we have the incredibly handsome, gorgeous, as he was known at the time, the handsomest man in England, Gurney. And Edmund Gurney was, of course, the first honorary secretary of the Society for Psychical Research. He takes over from the actual former secretary and does all of the correspondence. He spends incredible amounts of effort on writing and stuff, and he carried out a whole load of experiments in thought transference. So what is thought transference? Well, the Xenocards or Xenocards probably acted as a clue. It's just what we now call telepathy. And Frederick Myers comes up with the term telepathy. Here we've got Myers on the left and Gurney on the right, and they are, you can see that Myers is carefully beaming thoughts of his latest antics across to Gurney there. Myers' word telepathy brings a whole new concept into the English language, the notion of sending messages across the void. Probably wouldn't have any Star Trek without this, would we? So why did they need it? Because they believed that telepathic impressions cause hallucinations are the way in which apparitions appear. That apparitions may be telepathy between the living, or they may be telepathy between the dead, but there is a strong telepathic component. And they ask questions that favor this mental hypothesis. Now, mediumship is highly divided into two types. There's mental mediumship, which is the so-called higher phenomena, which is explicable by telepathy, where the medium receives messages to their mind or hears a voice in their mind. And there was physical mediumship, and physical mediumship where the spirits were conjured to visible appearance, or where trumpets rose and floated around the room, or where bangles and beads raised up, or where small statues might materialize out of nowhere, or flowers cascade from the ceiling. That kind of phenomena, physical phenomena, had actually been, by this point, by 1890, I think the SPR were very cynical about it. And you can see that in the Fielding report from 1904 about their last investigation of Eusapia Palladino. Time and time again, they had looked at physical phenomena, and they had found that physical phenomena appeared to be a no-no. It appeared to all come down to fraud. But they hadn't rejected, and in fact, they believed that there was a strong scientific case for what they called telepathy. So when they carried out the census of hallucinations, they were less interested in physical phenomena. And it soon became apparent that the telepathic hypothesis, let's give you an example of it quickly, because this is getting really dull. Keith, you're sitting there watching me, and let's imagine that I suddenly start to think about a nun, a ghostly nun on roller skates, eating an ice cream, carrying a whippet under her left arm. Yeah. And she's got a copy of the Sporting Life in her right hand, and she's also holding the ice cream in that hand as well while waving them around. I think about this idea, and if you suddenly saw that ghostly figure in your room next to you, You would be shocked, wouldn't you?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, but that is exactly the idea of how this works, is that you receive a telepathic idea from myself, and then your mind uses the same parts that are involved in dreaming or hallucination to generate a visual image which it overlays on the environment. So you're getting a psychic impression that you're converting into neural activity. So you're receiving a message, and the message is converted into neural activity. And that is roughly the most prominent theory of ghosts held by Gurney and Myers and some of the other early theorists of the SPR. And it went on to be the theory that was popularized and that lasts all the way through to Tyrrell. This is GNM Tyrrell. Jeffrey Merle Tyrrell. He wrote a wonderful little book called Apparitions. Be careful. It summarizes and presents the evidence from the senses of hallucinations, but in fact, at times, GNM Tyrrell's own biases and selective reading of it comes into play. And there are a couple of points where he flatly contradicts what the census actually said. Not that that matters, but, you know, just worth noting. And through his work, I think Apparitions, that was published possibly by Duckworth around about 48, it went on to be probably the single most influential book on people's ideas of what ghosts were. Just carrying on with the whole ESP thing, from 29 onwards, where Rudolf Tishner invents the word parapsychology, extrasensory perception has also become, or ESP has also become, a term that's in common use during the 30s and 40s. And it's J.B. Rhine who really takes parapsychology, makes it scientific or lab-based as far as he's concerned, scientific, and who produces a modern, the modern notion we see today. If you go to the Kostler chair, I expect some of the things which go on there would be familiar to Rhine. And parapsychology's got a massive literature. The psi hypothesis, the notion that ESP underlies a lot of these paranormal experiences, is pretty common, and psychokinesis and ESP certainly have become more generally accepted. So before we go on to theory, that was the dull bit. But why do I think then that there was this theoretical division between poltergeists and hauntings? Simply because the SPR fell out with the physical mediums. When they fell out with the spiritualists, they still accepted the possibility of survival, but they were led by the evidence. And although the SPR has never held collective opinions, what we call the SPR group, or their theorists who were working on what apparitions were highly skeptical. Podmore in particular, who believed poltergeists were naughty little girls, were highly skeptical about physical phenomena. So because they didn't believe in physical phenomena, when it actually manifested and there started to be evidence for it, they did not really have a theory which explained it, because until the notion of psychokinesis developed and started to become more popular in the 50s, there isn't much in the way ghosts were understood that actually explains how they can open a door or a window. And in fact, Tyrrell argues that if you see a ghost open a door, the door doesn't actually open. It stays in the same state it was before, but there's just a hallucination of it changing status. There is actually nothing actually happens. So according to most of Tyrrell and Gurney and Myers' initial ideas, and they did have different ideas at different points in their lives, both Gurney died tragically young, poltergeists and ghosts are completely different things. They cannot be the same. Very early on, again in the 19th century, at the end of the SPR period, there is a decision that poltergeists are related to human beings. And throughout the 20th century, that grows into the agent hypothesis, the idea that the poltergeist is a nervous breakdown outside the head and is always linked to a human. And I think probably D. Scott Rogo is the parapsychologist who does the most to popularize it. But William Roll, brilliant, absolutely brilliant writer, role almost certainly provided the best evidential case for him. Right, okay, we're all bored with that now, aren't we? That was the history. Let's go on to the theory. Sex and the single poltergeist. There are an awful lot of myths about gender, sexuality, and poltergeists, and one of the ones that I'm constantly knocking is the notion that poltergeists are linked to young women, preferably sexually frustrated young women. And the reason I think that that might have arisen is because most psychical investigators are sexually frustrated old men. No, I'm joking. No, but seriously, I mean, it's a well-known fact to the public that poltergeist agents are invariably, you know, young women who have gone a bit funny and who are having a strange experience, and their menses or their burgeoning sexuality or something else that, you know, scientists want to poke about and ask questions about is causing the actual experience. Now, I'm not saying that adolescents are not associated with poltergeists. They may be, but there is a classic book from 1979 written by Alan Gould and Tony Cornell. It's called Poltergeists. It is the single best book ever written on the subject. It is magisterial. I suggest everybody gets a copy. And in it, they look at 500 cases, which they draw from well-attested cases from different cultures and different periods. They put them together, and it is a magnificent piece of analysis. And they do not find that gender appears to be involved, or indeed age, or indeed many other things you'd expect. Poltergeists occur in the day as well as the night, etc., etc. So I just chucked in Sex and the Single Poltergeist with my seductive duck there, because I think that's something to always watch out for. Go where the evidence goes, not what people say is true. Plus, I wanted an excuse to have a duck in a little. So let's go forward to the 1970s. And this is where you're all going to come in, because I'm going to ask you to get involved and play. Is the Poltergeist living or is it dead? Is a classic article published by the JASPR by Professor Ian Stevenson. Now, by the time I first got involved in the 90s with psychical research, actively involved as opposed to just reading the SPR journal, 92 or 93, we went down to Coates to a case that I think most people would term a poltergeist case. It's near Cirencester. And when we arrived in Cirencester, we went to the house, and the family were very, very, very upset by some of the phenomena that he'd experienced. And the longer we were there, the more it became clear that it would have been termed a classic poltergeist. Pots and pans were moving. It's the case for those, I'm sure you've all heard my story, but I'll tell it one more time. There were three of us: David George, who's a chartered surveyor stroke architect, I believe, and he did a structural survey for us. There was Derek Newman, who is incredibly unreliable in many ways, and probably not here tonight, so I couldn't be rude about him, but Derek's quite a character, but I certainly would not necessarily, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, no one's testimony can be taken without doubt in these matters. You know, you need multiple witnesses. There was myself, Derek Newman, and David George, and the family had told us that a bedroom at the end of the house was haunted, and poor old Hugh Wake, some of you know who, was hiding outside in a bush with a pair of, I think, light intensifier goggles that someone had acquired. We didn't tell the family we were there, so he was just surveying the outside of the building to make sure no one was playing silly buggers. We decided we'd stick a video camera in the room, so we did. And for those who haven't heard the story, there's a small pink teddy bear which is sitting on a bedside table across from the door. We spend ages locking the door and putting down different seals on the door in different ways to make sure nobody enters it. Hear a bang, and we go back in and find the camera has dropped, and because the cables come out the back, and the teddy bear has moved from where it was sitting on the bedside table and where it is on the film on the bedside table As we walk in, it's sitting in front of the disconnected gas fire with its paws out as if it's warming itself, with its head turned towards us with a big grin. And Derek Newman started to sing "If You Go Down in the Woods Today," and I freaked out because I'm not a brave man. But on that actual case, the family had experienced a very large number of experiences that were far more dramatic than that. The only one that I recall was I was walking down the corridor, the upper corridor in the house, and there was a small balsa pot which actually just had written on it, "A present from the Holy Land." There was nobody else in the upper story apart from the dog at the far end, I think, and whoever was standing behind me. I can't honestly remember. It'll be in the report. And the balsa wood pot flew across the corridor. I didn't recognize it. I just saw a blur of motion. I didn't see it start. It flew out of one door and into another room that was almost completely empty and carpeted across from the one it started in. So it could have been thrown by somebody quite easily, but they would have had to have thrown it diagonally across the corridor. It moved at immense speed, and the strange thing was when it landed, it made a noise like a cannonball. It didn't make a sound like a little balsa wood pot hitting the ground. I honestly thought that, you know, a wardrobe had fallen over or something. And I went running in there. The dog started barking, and there was this huge crash. And the only thing that I could see in the room that, as I said, was almost empty apart from the carpet, was a tiny balsa wood pot. So at this point, it's a classic poltergeist case, yeah? I was woefully badly prepared to investigate anything. All I did was take huge amounts of interviews and statements and record testimony and do a lot of measuring and weighing of objects. And I think that was probably the most useful thing I could do at the time. I essentially tried to record the evidence in as much detail as I could. However, we soon hit a major problem, because people started to see ghosts. Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because theoretically poltergeists are associated with living agents. Who the agent or focus was the game I was playing. I was a psyche nurse at the time, and I was getting to know the family well. I was recording, and I was playing a game of which individual is closest to the objects when these things happen. And by the end of my first week or so of investigating, the person who was closest to most of the events seemed to be me, which wasn't entirely useful, as I clearly wasn't there for most of the hauntings before I arrived on the scene. But then people started to see apparitions, and the most common apparition that was seen on 3 or 4 occasions was a small boy. They described him as like Just William. He was wearing a red blazer, a red cap, short trousers, shirt, school tie, and he was usually seen, in fact, he was seen many times, I believe, but the 3 or 4 times that I'm most confident about people being certain that it was not a real person, he was inside the building. They pulled up in the car outside, or they were outside the building approaching the house, and they saw the boy inside the house looking at them through the window. And my absolute first thought was, it's a real boy. It's a 10-year-old boy. He's broken into the house. He's playing silly buggers. And that's what they're seeing, because it made perfect sense. But, you know, the house was actually very isolated. The more time I spent on the case, the harder I found. And then there were occasions when the boy was seen in locations where there seemed to be no physical way that he could have left the property, and he would have had to have gone past other people. So it became clear that the figure was apparitional. So at that point, I invented the word, as far as I know, I invented the word poltergeist, because this was a poltergeist case that had suddenly developed a strong apparitional element. And in my innocent, somewhat parapsychologically trained or parapsychologically informed mind, the two things were totally distinct. Why was a poltergeist manifesting around what was clearly an apparition? And in fact, later on, some of the researchers did discover that there had been a young boy of about that age who drowned in a quarry not far from the house and who'd lived in the house And so there was even some evidence that there could have been, you know, an identity, a known identity for the spook. It could have been a classic case if only my fellow researchers weren't totally unreliable. No, I'm joking. I can't say they were totally unreliable, but they were not easy people to get on with at times. I think they used to handcuff me at committee meetings to try and stop me from getting overly excited. I bet there have been times when the ASSAP have wanted to do that to shut me up as well. Anyway, on this particular occasion, I lived with them at the time, so it made life very difficult indeed till I managed to escape. Never, ever, ever go into psychical research for people you don't trust or get on with. Is the poltergeist living or is it dead? Well, this was the paper that restored my faith. Professor Ian Stevenson. It was from the JASPR. I managed to get a copy of it through, I think actually I copied it at the SPR offices in London. And what the paper does is simply asks this question. Stevenson, many of you may know through his work, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. In fact, he wrote a number of books. They're extremely expensive. But they are available, and he ran the Department of Perceptual Sciences at the University of Virginia. There he is on the right, and Professor Ian Stevenson is one of those great pillars of psychical research, parapsychology. He was very much interested in survival of bodily death, and he felt that it was well attested by a number of cases of reincarnation, strongly suggested by a number of cases of reincarnation, where young children show memories of previous existences. As such, he was willing to consider the notion that we could survive bodily death and that dead people might actually be behind both ghosts and poltergeists. It's a bit of a shocking notion, isn't it? Ghosts are dead people. Read all about it. So I'm now going to try a little exercise. I'm going to see if I can get this to work. Give me a moment. What I would like you to do is now, is this going to work? Oh, hang on a second. I am going to create 4 rooms. Actually, there's 40 of us. I'm going to create 8 rooms. I am going to assign people automatically, and I would like each group to come up with one person who's willing to talk, who can come up with these questions. If a poltergeist is a living person, is actually a psychic powers of a living human being, do you get the notion? So you're basically haunting yourself. The ghost is actually being caused by your own psychic ability, not by a dead guy. What kind of behaviors would you expect? What symptoms? What poltergeisty kinds of things? Secondly, what if it's a dead person? What if it's a person who lived and is no longer alive, an actual ghost? What then would you expect the ghost to, how would you expect the ghost to behave in that case? Let's look at what Stevenson suggested and see if you agree or disagree. And I'm aware it's getting later. Oh, hang on. What's happened to my evening teaspoon? This is what I wanted. So this is Ian Stevenson's famous paper, and this is his suggestion. Types of objects moved with a living agent, he said mostly light objects, with a discarnate agent, heavier objects, i.e. stones and bricks. I wonder why he came to that conclusion. Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Morley Rectory, famous for port or throwing of a brick.
Yeah, usually attributed to Harry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we said that. Harry Price, brilliant as he was, not really the most reliable.
No. Elena took a video when Alan Murdy was talking recently, in which a book moves behind Alan on the bookcase. And when I was with Carol at Hunstanton, we were in the caravan, and her husband Gary witnessed a small object movement there. If Carol's around, she can tell us about that in a minute. But shorter range, a few inches to 15 feet. Longer range, if you're dead, apparently, 30 to 50 feet. Flight paths, simple trajectories for living agents, discarnate agents, complicated trajectories with sharp angled turns, deflections, and changes of speed. Damage to objects moved, breakage common with a living agent, objects rarely or never broken with a discarnate agent. So discarnate agents are apparently not only more powerful, they have higher finesse and control over their power. Landing patterns, objects seem to fall or be knocked over, they land forcefully. Discarnate, objects seem to be carried and deposited gently. Motiveless motion of objects knocked over in a seemingly random fashion, versus for the dead, movement suggesting purpose, i.e. throwing a brick at someone. Benefit to subject may express their destructive impulses towards other people by the effects produced. The dead, subjects may be the object of destructive impulses or exploitation. There's no benefit to him from the phenomena and actually some disadvantage or injury. No meaningful communication by raps if it's a living agent. Meaningful responses obtained by raps if it's a dead agent. Apparitional and visual phenomena, absent or occurring later and not collective. Occurring early, abundantly, and collectively if it's discarnate. So discarnate does actually feature ghosts. Living agent, possibly less. Mediumistic trances and auditory communications, absent for the living, discarnate present. Location of phenomena, localized around a particular person, localized around a person or a place. Age of subject, under 28 years for living agent, no characteristic age for discarnate. Resolution with psychotherapy for a living agent, intersection, publication, exorcism, activity towards the discarnate agent for the discarnate. Now, what I want to know is how Stevenson came up with these patterns. He obviously does discuss it very, very briefly in his paper, but he doesn't really explain his thinking. One of the clear patterns is that he believed that the dead somehow had access to greater levels of power and greater control over their power than the living. There's a lady called Sarah, does a series of cartoons called Sarah Scribbles, which I don't know if you've seen Sarah's little cartoons, but they are wonderful. They're on the internet. I deliberately didn't copy them because I want people to go and look at Sarah Scribbles and find them rather than actually, and give her some money preferably, or at least give her the clicks rather than me pirating her art. But she recently did a cartoon in which she explains that poltergeists, objects knocked over, strange rapping noises, scratching things, objects moved around, are clearly the ghosts of deceased cats, because what else could be as destructive as a cat? So I thought that was quite clever. But actually, why would living agents not be more powerful? Why would living agents not be able to move things more than a few inches to 15 feet? Why is moving a wardrobe indicative that it's a dead person rather than a living person? Surely a living body has access to far more energetic reserves through a breakdown of sugars and the usual processes of biochemistry than an intangible person who, the energy involved in creating physical phenomena has to come from somewhere. So why should we assume the dead are more powerful than the living? All of this I find very interesting. I think we should have a discussion about it. There will be a part 2 to this at some point. I'm sorry for those of you who find it phenomenally dull, but I constantly try and tie it back, because if we're investigating to what happens if we're actually investigating a case, what are the implications? Well, one of the first things I'm going to say is that I don't believe that ghosts have ever been as clear-cut distinct from poltergeist phenomena. And when Mickey said that people in Ireland talk about their ghost stories but they don't talk about poltergeists, I think that's because Irish ghosts probably still knock on things, knock on doors. They probably still scratch on the walls. They probably still nick your hairbrush or your car keys, don't they? Is that true, Mickey?
Yes, but also I think because a lot of the time you blame the fairies, like.
Yeah, absolutely. You blame the fairies.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't you? Because that is exactly what, in fact, let's just go back up a couple. So the 4 options that are usually put forward for these kind of poltergeist phenomena are dead people, which we'll call ghosts in this case, daemons, and I called it daemons rather than demons because I'm including fairies, jinn, and other non-corporeal intelligences, so that there's a disincarnate thing in your house. It was never a human, but whatever it is, it's an intelligence that's causing you annoyance by, and it seems to have about the intelligence level of a rather dim Labrador, or possibly a very destructive rabbit. Psi or magic? Psi is simply the notion as a living agent who's involved. Magic, because traditionally witchcraft was blamed for an awful lot of these phenomena. And if it wasn't witchcraft, it was fairies or it was witchcraft. In the 18th century, everyone would have said witchcraft. In the 19th century, it was dead guys, maybe. In the 20th century, I think fraud was often put forward, but actually the human agent hypothesis, the living agent hypothesis. Podmore was certainly keen on fraud as an explanation for poltergeists. I don't think there's any way we can countenance that. If you've read Gould and Cornell, it just doesn't work. But let's just move on quickly. Go back down. So fairies, yeah. So if you understand them in Ireland in terms of the Fae, I think that's an absolutely sensible way. As I said, if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, call it a duck. And one of our most impressive cases, the one with the coffee cup that lifted off the table in front of 3 of us and flew over towards Derek's crotch and then dropped to the floor and smashed. It happened in front of myself, Matt, and Derek. I wouldn't have believed my eyes, but Matt and Derek can't stand each other. They always detested each other. If either of them had been pissing around, the other one would have immediately told me. I watched it. There was no doubt at all by what I saw. And that happened at the Stag's Head in Offchurch. I mean, there was a whole load of phenomena over a period of time. In the end, our method of dealing with it and calming things down was to suggest that they left a saucer of milk and some cupcakes for the fairies. And I know it's not terrifyingly satisfactory, but it did actually resolve things for the family and for Ian and Di. And at the end of the day, there's always this kind of, I wanted to carry on investigating, but at the end of the day, they wanted to get on with their lives and stop being bolted in the bathroom at night. They'd go to the toilet and somebody would slip the bolt on the outside of the door and leave them locked in the bathroom, which might sound funny, but I'm assured is actually quite irritating if you end up sleeping in your toilet all night. Okay, what time is it now, Claire?
It is 23 minutes past 8.
So the point I'm going to make is I don't think that ghosts and poltergeists are theoretically distinct categories. I think that arose out of a particular historical situation in early parapsychology during the incredibly important work of the SPR. I think they were onto something, but I think because they didn't consider psychokinesis, they coined the word telepathy, but psychokinesis as a notion comes much later. They didn't want to believe in physical mediumship. They had good reasons not to, and those who did tended to be often like crooks, accused of fraud, etc. So for the reason of pure science, they were trying to establish small gains and were trying to establish the mental phenomena. So they played down the role of the physical phenomena. The physical phenomena has always been part of hauntings, and I once started on that in 2010. I started my first ever paper for ASSAP, my first conference presentation for ASSAP, with the words, recently I was in a hotel room with a young blonde, and I found myself, as I always do, reading a book of ghost stories, which is probably not the best way to proceed. And I noticed that most of the cases that were recorded by Underwood or Andrew Green or whoever it was book I'd picked up actually included physical phenomena. And it made me realize that most haunted appeared to be closer and more accurate to the kind of phenomena that were being talked about in these ghost hunting accounts from the 50s and 60s and 70s than the classics of parapsychology would suggest. There is a strong amount of physical phenomena all the way through. And one of the issues, I think, is just that we didn't ask for it. And because of the theoretical constraints that have been placed upon us, we try and we place the phenomena within those theoretical constraints. Now, one of the implication for me comes mainly from my time at Derby Jail. So for a year after I got sacked from Most Haunted, or not sacked, just dropped without explanation, Richard Felix gave me a job up at his haunted Victorian wine cellar, as I jokingly refer to it, Derby Jail. And while I was there, every week, a couple of nights a week, I would spend the night there with a bunch of ghost hunters who would turn up. And they would record all manner of phenomena that I failed to witness on many occasions. But there was also phenomena that I was party to, or phenomena that seemed very real, even if I didn't experience it. I was absolutely convinced that they were getting something, or that they were experiencing stuff. The thing that was interesting was that although there were a few ghost stories that seemed to be fairly solid and that remained the same from group to group, certain groups brought their own phenomena with them. Occasionally there would be groups there who would always, every time they came in, would get the smell of violets or roses or strong floral scents. Other groups seemed to be associated with knockings on walls. There were even apparitions that seemed to only be seen when one group or another group were present. What I eventually decided was that the haunting at the jail, whatever it may be, always manifested in the form of the expectations of the group who came in. So nowadays, if I was working there, I would probably have a severe problem with demons. My head would, as I was talking to you now, probably be spinning around 360 degrees while I regurgitate pea soup, because that appeared to be the way we were going. And the fact that American TV has led many ghost hunting groups now to people that think in terms of demonology rather than the rather more innocent days of Most Haunted, would possibly make it a slightly scarier and more unpleasant place to be at night. But I must say that the expectations of the groups, whatever those expectations were, and the individual personalities appeared to manifest. And if any of the phenomena were objective or real, then I believe that they were shaping the phenomena. So every time we go into a case, whether it's Borley Rectory or it's whatever it is, wherever the location, we bring our own ghosts with us. We don't just bring our psychological baggage. If we do have any psychic abilities, we may be using them to alter the psychic milieu. The ghost might actually be being pushed around by our own unconscious drives. I tend to think that there is perhaps two elements, both a living and a dead, but that our own notions on our own psychic powers might somehow derive energy from the ghost. Why? Well, one of the notions that I've been playing with for a very long time, I'm going to call BDR, a belief defines reality. For a moment, let's assume that we go back to the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus talks in the Gospel many times about how your faith makes you whole, or because they had faith, they could perform miracles, and so on. It is the belief in divine power that allows your body to carry out the healing. It is your faith that makes you well. And faith is not the opposite of doubt. Faith is the ability to tap into and believe in and attribute your miracles to the divine. So, okay, so in this case, what I'm suggesting is that if you go into a haunted house and you know that objects can float around, that objects can mysteriously fly through the air, that apparitions can appear, that doors can open and close, that your kettle might turn itself on and off, or that even as I'm talking to you now, a book might fly off a shelf in your room, or your kettle might turn itself on, or there might be a loud knocking on the door behind you. Whatever that phenomena is, you might say, well, CJ's causing it. But actually, what is causing it is your own ability being unlocked by attributing it to the haunted. So if you believe there's a ghost in a house, then your own psychic powers might come to the fore. Do I believe in survival? As many of you know, I do believe that survival is fairly well evidenced, but I'm holding it as a principle of faith rather than an intellectual one at the moment. I've talked to David Fontana about it a few times, and I do think we probably survive bodily death. I'm just frustrated my parents never communicate with me. But anyway, the point is, and the thing that I'm really interested in here is, I think that whenever we go ghost hunting, we create and adjust and alter the psychic phenomena. And I'm going to talk about that in a future week. But in the meantime, the notion is, how do we tell the difference between the psychic pollution engendered by our ghost hunting efforts and the original phenomena? And how many times have you encountered in your investigation someone who said, well, before you turned up, the ghost was completely different. He doesn't like you, or he's changed his attitude since you walked through the door because we never saw that before, or something like that. So I think that we need to look at the ways in which we ourselves might be factors or variables within the poltergeist experience. It's getting late. I need something to eat. What time is it now, Claire?
We've just gone to 8:30. So
Okay,
perfect
I'm going to
timing.
shut up and call it a day. Claire will ask. We'll have a few questions, about 5 minutes max, because I really need